Welcome to the Waves Business Coaching Podcast, where you can equip yourself with the tools and insights to build the dream team your business needs. You can live with more confidence, master your people challenges, and reclaim your freedom. I'm your host, Jacob Karnes, a business coach and author of Master Your First Job. This week on the podcast, I interview my new friend Hector, who is a podcast. He owns Amplafy Media, a full production podcast company, and we have a conversation about podcasts. And this is super valuable for any business owner or business leader who sees himself as a thought leader in their space. We really talk about how podcasts can build a lot of trust and authority with your potential audience and really get really authentic with an audience. And what we touch in that, the 2024 election could be known as the podcast election. And we kind of dive into what we mean by that and why, and the role that podcasts are playing in the media landscape now, and why it's a good idea for a lot of small business owners to have a podcast. We talk about why and how you can build a podcast to grow your business. I wrote a book called Master Your First Job to help first-time employees thrive in their roles and to help business owners better understand and develop their young talent. If you'd like a free copy of this book, I'd love to give one to you. You just need to go to masteryourfirstjob.com/free. That's masteryourfirstjob.com/free. You can get a free e-copy of my book, also with instructions of how to send that to your Kindle if you're a Kindle user like I am. So make sure to go to masteryourfirstjob.com/free to get my book for free. All right, let's dive into this awesome conversation with Hector about podcasting. Hector, thanks so much for being on the Waves Business Coaching Podcast. Man, I'd love for you to share a little bit about you, your story, and kind of how you got to where you're at now.
Yeah, I am a father of two. We were chatting before we started recording. I have a 5 and a 6-year-old. So that's mostly what I do.
That's right.
And when outside of that, when they are either at school or doing, other things, I have a podcast production company that, pays the bills and allows me to live comfortably here in Southern California. And we've been doing that. We've been doing podcasts well before, presidential candidates were going on them and well before they were popular and sexy. I believe back in 2017 was when we started working with our first podcast. And since then, we've developed a full service podcast agency. We work with a lot of businesses and high-powered executives who have plenty of other things to do than podcasting. And so we make that part sort of easy for them.
I love that. And I'm really excited to talk about podcasting further because, obviously we are on a podcast. I've seen it as a value add to my business, and I'm excited to dive in and see how it could be a value add to others and why it's been a game changer. I'd love to know, before we dive in, what was your first job?
I'll share my first two because I think the second one's actually more relevant. My first one was I was a bus boy at a nice restaurant down in Abercrombie in Venice, California. And that was really, really cool because it was money. And then, but my second job was selling Cutco knives right out of high school.
Yeah.
And it was a big mind shift for me because I had worked, the whole summer, that summer before at the restaurant, and made, I don't know, a few $100s. After everything was all said and done, and which was cool because as a 16-year-old kid, a few $100s was like great.
It's like thousands now.
But I walked out of my first sales appointment after selling Cutco, and I had made, I don't know, like $40 off of the sale or something like that. But I started doing the math, and I was like $40, and I was in there for like 45 minutes, and I started like using my fingers to count, and I was like, I can make, I started doing the math and realized that as a, it was my first kind of inkling of self-employment or entrepreneurship. And I said, like, if I could get better at this, I can make even more. And so since then, I've kind of been on this path to do my own thing, and podcasts, is sort of the manifestation of that today.
I had a friend who did Cutco in high school. Did you like door to door for Cutco?
Essentially, they used to say, don't say that because it's legal. Technically we can't say that, but essentially we would schedule a time before we got there.
Yeah.
But we would still be, I can't tell you how many middle-aged women's kitchens I've sat down and lugged my bag in there and pulled out the knives and we chopped up all the stuff. And so, but, I'm grateful because I use those skills every day. The ability to talk, the ability to, sales on a one-on-one basis. It was just fundamental in growing a business. So, everything sort of happens for a reason. You kind of put the pieces together looking backwards.
Yeah, it's cool you say that because, like, that's why I wrote my book, Master Your First Job, was that same reason of I'm like, there's skills that I learned as a minimum wage worker that I'm still using. And I'm so grateful that I got those there so that I could take them with me throughout my entire career, which I think is really important. So podcasting has been a game changer. And I mean, I watched a YouTube video recently by Colin and Samir where they just called this like the podcast election. And you mentioned it, like presidential people going on podcasts, and podcasts I think are a great like snapshot in time, or excuse me, elections are a great snapshot in time to see where is media at this point in time, right? Like the famous was JFK and Richard Nixon debate, first televised debate, right? And like Nixon sweating, and people are like, that's why he lost the election. And this election was the podcast election. You know, we're recording this in January, so I'm like, we're about a week from the inauguration, and it's fascinating to see how much podcasts have grown. Can you share like how you got into the space and what excites you most about like the role podcasts are playing in the media landscape today?
Yeah, I'd gone, sold Cutco through college, and even out of college, grew a sales organization, and we did millions of dollars of sales, and recruited and trained thousands of salespeople, and so sort of climbed that ladder, made a lot of money, blew a lot of money, and realized that there was something else that I wanted to do. We also found out that my the mother of my kids was pregnant for with our first kid, and so I knew that spending all of that time doing that job was not going to be conducive to being the dad that I wanted to be. And so I started looking at other things. And one of the books, two books that I read, one was Platform by Michael Hyatt.
Okay.
And which talked about essentially the value of being a thought leader, the value of putting out content, in a, to position yourself in a way that, in the marketplace, right? And that was an interesting concept for me, because I was just doing sales where every time I walked into someone's house, I had to start from scratch and rebuild that connection and rebuild that relationship. And they had no idea. They were kind of scared of me, because it's this guy walking into my house who I haven't met with a bunch of knives. It's a very interesting sort of dynamic to all of a sudden turn that into a positive buying relationship. And so I realized that, Michael Hyatt talked about in Platform, you could sort of pre-sell, or I think, what is his name? He wrote Persuasion. He also wrote Persuasion, but there's another famous book on sales and talking about, pre-positioning yourself so that when you get into, the sales conversation, they're already respecting you more. There's already that credibility. And so that was one book, and I guess a few books that I'd read during that time. Another one was Ask Gary Vee, or Gary Vee had written a number of books in that time. Jab, Jab, Right Hook was another one, but essentially talked about sort of what you had mentioned, is what is the media landscape of the day. And it was right after Instagram sort of started to allow videos. YouTube was obviously budding and emerging, but it was this really interesting time where the barrier to entry to creating content or being like a media entity was gone. There were bloggers, but not a lot of people knew how to write. I mean, I was terrible at writing, and so that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
And so right when I started to pursue different, look at different channels, Facebook Live came on. Okay. And Zuckerberg released Facebook Live as a feature, and they started really pushing it. And so I was just I'm like, I need clients, I need attention. I'm like, someone challenged me, and we had a group of buddies who we said, okay, we're just going to do a Facebook Live a day. It was like, there's 3 of us guys. And we did it for about, I think some of us continued for a couple of years, because after that time I had done about over 300 live streams, and just saw that content was a way to sort of garner attention. I started getting I was getting consulting gigs and getting service, clients from people that I'd never met. People would reach out on Facebook and say, hey, I saw your video. I have this problem. Can you help me solve this? Yeah. And they kept going, so I realized that was happening. I kept leaning into it, and eventually in about 2017, all this time I'd never started a podcast because it was too technical. It was too it's much easier than it is today. But even looking back on it, it was actually a lot scarier. It seemed a lot scarier than I thought, it was in reality. But I had done hundreds of live streams. I had built a YouTube channel. I'd create all this content, but it hadn't started a podcast for some reason.
Yeah.
But I had somebody reach out to me, and they said, hey, we have this podcast. It's like a 2-hour live stream. Not everybody's watching the full thing, but there are like these really great segments, and we don't have the time to go in and clip these up and take all these highlights out, but we want to start posting them on Instagram. We want to start posting these things on YouTube. Can you do that for us? And I'm like, I need money. Yeah, I know how to do that.
That's right.
We'll do it.
Right.
And we had another one reach out to us, and another, and we had, more and more podcasts started reaching out, and I'm like, this podcast thing, there's something here. And I sort of pivoted out of my old industry, closed up my old agency, and jumped all into podcasts. And so since 2016, 2017, we've been going all in on podcasts. And we started out doing the marketing for it, so like the promotion, the social media stuff. But then we realized, like, hey, if we want to grow it more, like, we got to make it better. And your editing and your sound sort of sucks. So we started taking over that part.
Yeah.
And then, we started realizing that, like, okay, your show premise sort of sucks. Like, you as a host could probably get a little better. So we started doing more of the show development and the strategy. And, now we sort of built the team that can do everything. And it's been great because a lot of people go, oh, podcasts are so whatever. And they insert word. And it's like, we've been there since they were very unsexy. And I had to, like, explain it. I used to explain, I'm like, it's like Netflix for your radio. Like, I used to use that a lot because people didn't understand what a podcast was. And so I'm very excited that now, we've had the election of the podcast.
That's right. I'm like, and I feel like everyone has a podcast now, which definitely made me hesitant to even want to do it because I'm like, man, the market's so saturated. But I've also read a lot of stuff to saying it's still a way to do it. And I've seen Fortune 500 or, Fortune 1000 executives launching their own podcasts. Why do you think there's this uptick in executives launching podcasts?
It really is what you saw from the election. And despite all of what your notions are, your beliefs, or your political affiliations, I think one side clearly utilized podcasts in a way to create a real connection with the listeners, and also to remove a lot of the false narratives that were just, a lot of the noise. Let's put it that way. There's a lot of noise that's out there. And when you listen to someone sit down on a podcast for, in these instances, these officials were sitting down for 2-3 hours sometimes, you really get to know somebody. And it's possible to BS for a little while. It's really hard to do that over and over consistently for hours. And so I think that in the same way, you take that and someone is casting their ballot they're casting their vote in this sort of election, but in the same way, people are casting their vote with their dollars. And so in the same way that someone wants to make sure that they're making the right decision with their vote for their elected official, they want to make sure that how they're voting with their dollars is being spent the right way, and also the time as well. And so we have executives that, we produce their shows, and they're signing contracts that are 6 and 7-figure contracts, and the people are going and doing their research and their due diligence on the podcast. And because they can listen to an individual for 2, 3, 4 hours, they can get a good idea of whether or not they vibe or they trust that person.
Right.
And it's even happening on the employee side. We have clients who, new hires or people that are coming into for interviews, they're saying, yeah, I listened to your podcast. I really vibe with your culture and your thought process and the whole thing. And so it can be really this way to establish that relationship at scale and in sort of an async fashion, which means that people can do it on their own time while they're exercising or on their treadmill or gardening or doing their dishes. It's something that doesn't require both people to be there at the same exact time.
It's fascinating. And I'm glad you mentioned the election because I watched this one video and then I watched several more of just breaking down the amount of content that was on just YouTube from each candidate. And one side had I think it was 18 hours worth of content just on YouTube that you could consume. And the other one had I think it was 3. It was 6 times as much more content. And that you could just, again, the opportunity to just listen to them talk, hear about them. And I think it was, you mentioned this, but I think it was Joe Rogan who said this of when I sit someone down for 3 hours, about the 45-minute mark, you kind of lose the speech. You lose the okay, I went through the stage speech you've seen me do 100 times. Now we can actually get in a real conversation. The script is gone, right? Script's out the window at about the 45-minute mark. And now you can really talk to somebody, which is fascinating. And to your
I had
point,
a PR strategist on yesterday who was talking about the other side of that is like TV, right? Where you're there for 60 seconds and you've got to have your talking point. And that worked for a generation.
It did.
But things have shifted, obviously.
I think it's also fascinating because I think the mantra out there is that with, I'm a millennial, I'm the youngest millennial. So I'll say with Gen Z, especially, this idea that they won't consume long form content. Like it's got to be short, TikTok, Instagram reels, average view times 3 minutes. But then you see podcasts like Joe Rogan, where it's 3 hours long, getting millions of views. And I don't know what the average watch time is on those, but I think it's a partial myth that they're only consuming short form content. Have you seen that, like in the podcast world, that long form content is still around and connecting?
Yeah, for sure. If not just for the fact that people will go through and you'll have a 3, 4 hour conversation, 2 hour conversation, and they'll pull out 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 segments from it that are almost independent in their own sort of
Right.
right as a piece of content. And so both of them, I think that there is the middle is losing out for sure.
Yeah.
Right. There is a challenge in getting someone to sit down for, say, even 15 or 25, like that middle is that's challenged. But the short and the long, or what we try and help our people to see, is the short from the long. Right. It's not like, if you can kind of figure out that game, that's I think the holy grail, if you will.
So we've seen these leaders utilize podcasts, like you mentioned, being able to see workplace and culture. What other benefits do you see from these leaders who are starting podcasts at these big companies to share their voice and their insights?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that a lot of them see, though, is they see a lot of new influencers or new people coming on the scene that understand the media game, understand the content game, and built these large followings, get these huge outsized opportunities. And then you have people with real life experience sitting there and going like, well, hey, we've been doing this for decades. Why
Yeah.
aren't I getting any of that attention, any of that shine? And it's like, well, because you're sitting behind the digital curtain, if you will. And so coming in front of that curtain and being in front of at the front of the stage is something that not a lot of executives are willing to do, just because they've always done it the way they've always done it, or insecurities, or like whatever. You can pick any number of reasons why they don't. But then on the other side of it, once they do, we see a number of things. The first thing is just like what we call like thought leadership or positioning. But all of a sudden, someone becomes like the person for that sort of thing, and we see it happen over and over again in niche after niche in industry. We worked with a pharmacist a number of years ago, and he was moving out of just becoming a regular pharmacist and having his own pharmacy, and moving into the space of being a pharmacist consultant and training and coaching
Yeah.
other pharmacists on how to run their business and run a holistic and healthy sort of practice and such. And he was looking for ways to sort of let people know that, hey, I do this now. And so we started a podcast, and we only did one season. We only did one about 12 episodes. But after that first season, he started getting calls from these coalitions of pharmacists. The industry is kind of broken up in these different organizations and associations and stuff. And they had an organization of about 6,000 pharmacists come and say, hey, we need training on this stuff that you talked on your podcast. Can we pay you tens of thousands of dollars to come and train all our pharmacists? And so you have things like that people start to realize that person does this. And then they're able to
Yeah.
see that the proof is in the pudding, or you're able to sort of highlight that real credibility because they can go down the rabbit hole. And so that's sort of the first thing, is that people start getting opportunities to them that they probably should have already been getting, but for whatever reason, they weren't either top of mind, or people didn't know that they spoke about that or could
Yeah.
do that certain thing. And so it's a really great way of positioning that. The second thing is, we find that when our shows start being consistent, they start finding themselves in the rooms and the offices of people that they didn't think that they would be sitting down with. So whether that's ideal clients or potential partners, or we've gotten some of our shows with legislators and key government officials, that they're not the only reason that they're talking to these people is because they have a podcast. And because of that, they're able to develop a relationship. They're able to create real connections. And so there's real business, there's real things that are happening because these relationships are developing. And so there's all these sorts of advantages. The challenge is that it's a little different than what most people typically associate with a podcast, which is I want to get a bunch of downloads and I want to be number one on Apple and I want to have all these sort of reviews, and those are great as well. But oftentimes the vanity metrics of social media and podcasting specifically don't always translate to business. It's not always a direct correlation.
Right. Let me ask you this. I'm like, I think it's getting really niche down into like the benefit of a podcast than what it could have for a small business. What makes a podcast good? Like, there's a lot of podcasts up there. What separates the good ones from the bad?
The best way that I can answer that question is that if the podcast is for a particular somebody or somebodies, then that's a good podcast.
Okay.
The challenge is when you try and make a show for everybody.
Yeah.
I want, or you make it too wide. We have some people that when we're starting podcasts, they come in, they say, who do you want to listen? And they're like, well, we want, women between the ages of 25 and 45. And I'm like, okay, well, you name one song that a 25-year-old likes and a 45-year-old likes today.
Yeah.
Like, what things are 25-year-olds and 45-year-olds doing that are the same? They wear different clothes. They listen to different music. They hang out at different places. Look to the market and just see from that trying to make something that broad is near impossible. Now, are there people doing it? Are there examples and people are yelling at their screen or yelling at their, phone saying, what about this? Of course. But when we're talking about like what's going to give us our best chance, we've got to make it really specific. And so we think of like three sort of characteristics, right? There's the demographics, so like the age and where they live and their genders and identities and associations and those sorts of things. The second thing is psychographics, which is, okay, what do I believe? How old am I? And do I lean this way? Do I lean that way? Am I, what am I excited about? And then the third thing, which we find is especially important for podcasts, is what life event or what like catalyzing event are they going through that's making them seek out podcasts? Because podcast is a very, I'm going to go find the information. It's not like a TikTok where I'm just getting thrown something and the algorithm's going to try and guess what I like. Podcasts are very, I'm going to go seek this information because I know that I'm going through something that maybe I'm trying to lose weight. Maybe I'm trying to gain weight. Maybe I got out of a relationship. Maybe I'm trying to get into a relationship. Maybe I'm trying to start a business. Maybe I'm trying to sell a business. All of these are different shows, but anybody who tries to make just a general business show or a general health and fitness show or a general relationship show, it's going to be really hard to cater to those because people only listen on average to about 7 shows. So you've got to be very important in their sense of urgency for them to choose to listen to you, right? It's not like where they're scrolling through a feed and they follow thousands of people, so maybe you'll pop up. They have 7 shows that they listen to. And so in order to be, it's like the MySpace top 8, like in order to be in the top, what sets you apart? And if you have the answers to what someone is going through, they don't care who you are, or they care less about who you are. I listen to podcasts all the time because I search in something and I'm like, here's the exact scenario that I'm going through. Oh, here's a show about exactly that. Let me click in and listen. And I'm 45 minutes in and I don't even know the host's name. So I think that's important is being true to your listener. And then as the host, you've got to kind of make decisions. We were talking earlier today about you not bringing on certain guests that aren't going to jive with your audience, or, understanding which questions are they probably asking in their heads. What topics are they excited about? Things like that are what I think make a good show. And then production and all that sort of stuff comes next.
Yeah. I'm trying to find this guy's name. Oh goodness. Sean. This is going to bother me. Sean Cannell does YouTube stuff.
YouTube guy.
Media. Yeah. Something he said that I thought was very similar. He talks about on YouTube, to make a YouTube video successful, ASQ, like answer a specific question. As you were talking about what makes it good, it's like people are seeking out an answer, right, to a question they have a lot of times. And I like your stat about the 7 shows, because I was trying to count how many that I listen to consistently. I mean, it's less than 7. I probably listen to 4 consistently. And then, there's some that, like, if an episode pops up that it looks like an interesting guest, or to your point, an interesting topic, then I'll listen to that. But yeah, you really do have to niche down, because if not, you're going to miss your ideal audience member, right? Like when you try to be something to everybody, you end up being nothing to everybody is what ends up happening.
Well, I think that's what's also really interesting is that some of these shows that we work with, and people would be really surprised to hear what most big shows actually get in terms of podcast download numbers. I think it's something like if your show gets more, and hey, there's a better statistic, but it's something like more than 100 downloads in the first like 24 hours, you're like in the top 10% of shows.
Wow. Okay.
So like only 100 people. Now, some people typically they look at 100 and they're like, only 100 views. It's like people get pretty disappointed when they see that because they're used to seeing views on Instagram or TikTok or even YouTube to an extent. And the challenge with that is that a view on TikTok is such a different level of depth of experience than a listen in podcasts. And so I think that that's a really big distinction that people need to make, is that they need to be okay with sort of less numbers. And the way that I think about it is like, okay, if you had 100 people, now oftentimes people on a TikTok video, they're spending 7 seconds on that video, maybe, right? On a podcast episode, I mean, we look at the stats, people are oftentimes spending 30, 40, 50 minutes, 60 minutes on average, like they're getting through a large chunk of it. And so it's a totally different weighted sort of experience. And so instead of thinking about getting 100 TikTok views, it's like, well, what if you had 100 people show up to you and they were standing around you waiting to talk and they were looking at you and listening? Like you need more chairs.
But yeah.
You'd be sweating at
Uh-huh.
100 people who are sitting listening to you for 45 minutes, right? Like that for a lot of people is a different sort of experience, and that's probably how it should be weighted. And so I think that that's also important to realize, is that the depth of the connection that happens over that. We don't always send, downloads are great, but if you can look at, well, people have listened to you for hundreds of hours, right? There's like thousands of hours of people consuming your content. It's like, well, that's a different level of relationship that's been built, as opposed to someone who's just scanned you while they're, standing in line at Starbucks.
That's huge. And like that, building that authenticity, I think is it something I really hadn't thought about with the podcast audience, is the level of depth. Although I know it's longer, I really hadn't thought about the level of depth of like relationship and trust you build with someone just because you consume more of their content in the podcast like medium rather than, like you said, the TikTok algorithm that is like throwing a bunch of stuff at you, trying to guess what you like. So let me ask you this. How important is consistency? So if I'm a small business owner and I'm like, you know what, I want to build an authentic connection with potential clients of mine, I want to start a podcast. Like, how important is the consistency when it comes to a podcast?
Over the long term, it's of the utmost importance. And people go, okay, well, I want to be consistent. So, they sort of take sort of what you've done with the show, which is go, okay, so let me scale back the number of publishing my episodes. That's great and fantastic. If you're playing the long game, because what that also does is it drags out the time that it takes to see the return on that. And so we've had some people where they say, well, I only want to release once every 3 weeks. And it's like, okay, that's fine. But we usually start to see stuff happen after, about episode 12. We see like phone calls start to happen. People start to notice, things start to, start kind of like wake up or sort of to pay attention. And so if that used to take a quarter, you used to be able to do that in a quarter. In Q1, we can sort of get some attention. If all of a sudden you're stretching that out over the entire year, now it challenges the sample size, right? Because now all of a sudden we've seen people do that, and then now they get anxious because they're like, well, nothing's happening.
Right.
Well, it's like, well, this was sort of the path that you chose. So I think consistency is important. Twice a month is great. If you can get to like once a week, like we think that level of consistency, or like 50 episodes a year, or
Okay.
even if you do like, you have a season where you launch and, for a period of time, and then you take a break and then you come back and then you release for a period of time. We've seen that work really well because there's being consistent over the long term. But yeah, I do think that it is important in building some.
Yeah, it's, I'm like, and I think about maybe too, like, what's the purpose of it? Because I think if you release a season that's on a specific topic, that's like super specific, and this is where it's the good thing about it being Netflix like and not real time, and you can make a timeless podcast, right? Where there can be an episode from 2018 that you're like is still evergreen that you can go back and listen to. Versus, like I'll say with my podcast, I want to be in someone's email inbox, once a week, and this allows me a medium to do that. Of like, hey, here's some valuable content, and like here's how I can be consistent with that. So, do you think it can
Well,
be depending on
to
like
your point,
what the
the
purpose is?
evergreen, yeah, to your point, the evergreen part is really great. And you can do it in seasons. You can even do it in episodes. I encourage a lot of our clients to use the podcast in their sales process. And because you can record an episode that handles a certain objection or highlights a certain feature or whatever part of the sales process that you're trying to illuminate, right? And you can go as granular, as wide as you want. But you can now throw that into a podcast episode and you can send that to them as whatever, as a way to sort of nurture that lead down the sales process. And because it's on Spotify, for whatever reason, there's such a lower barrier to entry, or perhaps it's because you're listening to it on Spotify that the lead establishes I don't know the phenomenon. But there is something that where you send that via podcast is a lot more effective than sending it in like a 3-part web series or opt into this mini class or all the other sorts of ways that I've seen people sort of drip out the Jeff Walker launch process. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his formula, but it's like video 1, you cover this, video 2, you cover this video. And then by the 4th or 5th video, they're ready to buy because you've handled all the objections sort of along the way. You can do the same thing. And because it's up on Spotify for as long as you have the podcast, up on your hosting provider, even if you did record it in 2018, you could still send that to leads today. And assuming that the content is still relevant, it's going to be just as effective as when you recorded it.
Do you think I guess location is important then? Because to your point, it's like, if I'm like, hey, sign up for this webinar, it's live, it's on Zoom next week, versus you're already on Spotify or pick your podcast app, you're already on YouTube. I'll send you this link to, I say like a place you're already familiar with, right? Like you're already there and present. So when I say, hey, here's a Spotify link, you think that's important? Like it's somewhere where they already are?
I do, because I think people go into those webinars already with their guard up.
Yeah.
With their psychological sales, guard up, looking for, they have that guard, whether that's conscious or subconscious, that's up. And almost by sort of the mechanism, the podcast is on the opposite side, right? Because a lot of times people are listening to it while they're driving or while they're working out or on the treadmill. And so there's almost this hypnotic, like sort of thing. And I could go down that sort of route, but I think that does play a part because people are sort of lulled is the wrong word to use, but that's the only word that's coming to mind. But that guard is sort of dropped because they're not expecting it.
Right.
Their brain is used to receiving helpful information and content in this app, Spotify, and that's the same exact place where you're doing it. And I would encourage you not to like make it a total sales pitch, right? Make it valuable, even if it's advertorial sort of content. I would lean that way for sure. But I do think there is something to the placement of it in terms of their receptivity to it. Now, on the other side, you don't know when they're listening to it. You don't know if they are going to listen to it. So at least if they're on the webinar, you have that opportunity to sort of hard close them if you want to.
Yeah.
But it's just, I think, different sliders on that same spectrum.
So if I'm a small business owner and I'm thinking about like maybe a podcast is right for me, how do you think they can amplify themselves as like a thought leader in their industry? Like, can a podcast help with that, of separating them? I mean, I'll just use a very niche example. If I'm a Chick-fil-A owner operator and I'm like, I'm a chicken franchise, right? I'm selling chicken, but I really want to kind of, amplify myself as a thought leader and show people that, we do stuff more than chicken. Is podcasting a good way to do that?
I think it's the best.
Okay.
because you can, if you have the credibility already to start talking about what you know, great. It's an opportunity there. And because it's a sort of that pull sort of mechanism, you're only going to be talking to people who want to listen to you. So it's a place where you can almost go and dump that information, and you just, it's there, and it just continues to build. And so that continues to build. And when people find it, there's a larger sort of rabbit hole for them to go down. If you don't, though, I also think that it's a great way for someone who goes, I want to be like a thought leader, or I want to make an impact in this space.
Yeah.
And for me, I was like, but I don't know. People don't know who I am. I don't have any sort of real, like, and that real part could be, argued different ways.
Yeah.
But at least my perception was like, I don't have the credibility yet to start telling people what to do. And so in that instance, what I did was I took the sort of, you call it like a journalistic sort of approach, investigative sort of approach, and started to instead go, okay, I don't have the answers, but there are these people who seem to have some answers. Let me go talk to them. Let me go get the answers. And by proxy, I'm going to get the answers for myself. And so because I'm doing that, I'm getting the answer. So eventually one day I can be that person where I can say, here's what I've learned, here's how to do it. And also by that same proxy and association, people see me next to all these experts, and they start to think that I too am some sort of, I start to move myself into that box.
Yeah.
And over time, that role can sort of shift, where you go from a journalist to, we call it, sort of a journalist to a mentor, or a mentor to an expert. But you play these sort of different roles. And I think the podcast can do that no matter what stage you're at in the journey. I've gotten the chance to interview people that I would have no chance, no other reason to talk to other than they have a podcast.
Yeah.
Best time selling authors. I mean, names that everybody would, has known and seen. And it's like, the only reason that this person's talking to me is because I have a podcast. And some of those relationships still carry on to this day. So it's not like it's for nothing either, or it's not like it's totally just this vanity sort of thing. Or I never really enjoyed like the popularity sort of contest. Maybe it's because I was never good at them. But I also think that there's some real value to creating the connections and the relationships through, a podcast.
Yeah. And I think something you said is so important, which is and you and I have both seen this, the relationships you can build through the podcast avenue can last a long time and be incredibly valuable. I have one last question that's kind of like a barrier thing. So I think one of the biggest barriers, if someone's like, yeah, I want to do this, but podcasting takes a long time, takes a lot of effort. I don't have a nice camera. Microphones are expensive. Like, how can someone start on a budget, both with time and finances, to get a podcast off the ground?
I don't know. You've got to pick one or the other. Right.
I'm with you. I think that's a good idea. I think that's a good way to put it.
You've got to either say, I'm going to do this on a budget and I'm going to invest a lot of my time, or you got to say, I don't have a lot of time and I'm going to have a budget to invest. And I would think of it as like, in the same way that people should have a budget for whatever their hobbies are, whether it's golf or massages or like whatever your hobbies are. I mean, you spend X amount of money per month on that. Could you reallocate that to paying somebody, a few $100 to edit your podcast so you could talk to the people that you want to talk to? And then for some reason, people have this weird block with like outsourcing, or like, I want to do it. And it's like, okay, dude, you want to paint your house too? Like I don't know. You can. You're totally capable of doing it, but it's going to take you forever. It's going to look like crap. And then you're going to wonder, like, what was the actual point of me doing this? Because you're too prideful. I mean, so that's like, okay, I'm going to settle down a little bit. But that's because I see these people who are high powered executives, and it's not the money for some reason. It's like they spend way more money than they would spend outsourcing this, but for whatever reason, there is some holdup in their head about them needing to do this part of the podcast. So I just encourage people to sort of look at it that way. On the other side of it, I would say, okay, yeah, you probably need a good enough camera and a good enough mic. And the nice thing is that there's it's not going to cost you thousands of dollars, but probably for a couple $100 you could get a good setup. Our recommended setup to our clients when they sign on to us is about like $300 total, with everything. So it's like you're looking at that. And then the challenge is there's some, softwares and all those sorts of things that you got to learn, which is also why I'm like, pick the path that you want to take, because you could go, all right, I'm going to take the budget route, and then realize that you are 40 hours into learning this new editing software and you still don't understand what you're doing. And it's like,
Yeah, I think a good point you made is that because podcasting has gotten so popular, like the entry fee to get in has gotten a lot less because all these tech companies are competing to get it in your hands at the cheapest price possible, and so there's a lot of like really good value mic, camera, etc. out there that the entry fee has gotten way lower, which is huge to get into the space. If there's one big takeaway today from our time together, what would you want people to take away from our conversation?
what I try and leave with is that like I have a dream one day of someone listening to our podcast on the way to Mars.
Yeah.
When I think about like
Uh-huh.
they're on a long trip, what are they going to do? They got to listen to something.
Like, listen to something.
Probably going to listen to a podcast,
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's my like, okay. And I say that sort of in jest, but I look at podcasting as really a vehicle for, evolving humanity past where we're at.
Yeah.
If you listen to some of the shows, I go, sort of on some of these metaphysical and spiritual sort of tangents and rabbit holes. But I do think that podcasts as a medium, whether it's to evolve ourselves personally, whether it's to evolve ourselves as a business or even collectively, I think it is a vehicle to do that because of all the reasons that we talked about today. And so when someone is looking at it as a vehicle for either them or their business, I just hope that they see it for not what it is today, but for what it's going to be, or what maybe not what it's even perceived as today, because I think it may even have a larger impact than is we're realizing. I think one day we're going to look back at like podcasts and the printing press, like next to each other as two revolutionary things. Because I can go on that tangent. Like the printing press was one directional, but podcasts are two directional, and it's distributed. So I think that the power that creates, and the information spread, and the knowledge and the wisdom sharing that has happened because of podcasts, frankly, I think it's going to surpass anything of the printing press over time. Anyways, that's what I want to leave people with.
That's fun to think about how revolutionary podcasts have been. And I mean, to bring it full circle, it might have changed an election this year. Like as we're recording, and it's kind of crazy the weight that podcasts hold in the media landscape, which is very cool. And it's very cool that also anyone can get into it, right? It's not like you have to be some famous newscaster to get on TV. Anyone with a mic and a camera can kind of get on a podcast and host,
and
it
some
for free
courage
on these hosting websites, and some courage. That's right.
And some courage. Yeah.
Hector, where can people find out more about you and your business if they want to get started with the podcast?
If you want to connect with me, the best place is Instagram and LinkedIn. I'm at Hector_podcast. My last name is Santiesteban. So there's another doctor that's out there. So I got to try and beat the other Hector Santiesteban in Google rankings. But if you go there is a link with a bunch of podcast resources. So you can use I have like a little AI agent that you can ask questions, and a bunch of different free downloads that you can get. So I'll send that to you, Jacob, for the link. And then our business is at Amplafy Media. That's AMPLAFY. Both because I'm from LA, and also because I started the business in a time where it was cool to misspell things. AMPLAFY Media.
I love it. I'll have those linked down below in the episode description. Hector, thank you so much for being on. Really enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you all for listening and watching to this episode of the Waves Business Coaching Podcast. Have a great week. We'll see you next time. Take care.